Thank you very much, and welcome to the Sam King community. Today we have such a wonderful lesson presented to us by Dr. Brandon Price, as you can see. And the title of the lesson is Active Learning as an Effective Entrepreneurship Teaching Process. So today we're going to dive in and get into the details of how active learning will help us, will help in entrepreneurship. And I advise you, like I always do, to listen attentively, be active learners, and ask questions at the end. With this said, I'll hand over the program to Dr. Brandon Price. And
Okay. Very good. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to have a chat with you folks. And like the moderator said, feel free to ask questions. If you have a question along the way, don't worry about it. Just interrupt. Okay, not a problem at all. That's part of active teaching or active learning. Just to tell you, pardon me, a bit about myself. Actually, I started out as a theoretical physicist, and I worked in a national laboratory for a number of years. But I switched fields and went over to medical devices. But even when I was working with universities, I still was involved in startups, in this case, technical research institutes. And I've been involved in biotech, United States state biotech organizations, been chair in 2 different states. But really, my career was involved in entrepreneurship. I co-founded a bunch of companies. I've been privileged to be CEO of 6 more companies. I've won some awards along the way. I'm right now, at this moment, working for 5 companies, either as a member of the board or as a member of the advisory board. And I work a lot in Africa with 2 organizations, including Tom King. And I've lectured a lot around the world. The current startups are all over. They're in Ann Arbor and Houston, Nairobi, and Richmond. And I have 2 academic positions, one down here in Mexico where I live, and also in Virginia. And I give an entire course about entrepreneurship and business planning to mostly engineering students at both of these universities. So what we're going to talk about today, just an overview, why do startups fail? What is the whole notion of active learning? And I'm going to use an example of that in race car driving and what it means, passive versus experiential versus active. And I'm going to turn that on its side, and we'll talk about what it really means with respect to entrepreneurship. I'm going to give an example from marketing, and I'm going to give another example in finance, active versus passive learning, okay? And then we'll talk about how it can be adaptable to different kind of learning modalities, and then there's a take-home message. So again, along the way, if you have a question, pipe up, okay? But most people think becoming an entrepreneur is kind of like, jumping off a cliff, and you're not sure what's going to happen when you reach the bottom. Most people hope this is what happens. You end up in a pile of something soft and spendable. But the fact is that for most ventures, this is what happens. They die. Most new entrepreneurial ventures fail. And the statistics are pretty stunning. In the United States, which has arguably the best ecosystem for entrepreneurial startups in the world, after 1 year, only about half are still living. After 2 years, about 20% are living. And after 5 years, among all entrepreneurial startups, about 98% are dead. Okay. What's the reason for that? Well, there's a lot of people who write about it and study about it, but there's basically 5 reasons why startups fail. The first is, and 42% of startups fail because they don't build a product that the market wants. And marketing people call that product market fit. The next largest reason, 29%, is pictorially pictured there. They run out of cash, okay? Financial issue. And there's other reasons. About a quarter fail because they don't hire the right people. A little less than a fifth fail because they don't have a business model. And I'm not here to describe what a business model is, but it's how you're going to make money. And some fail because they don't care about marketing and sales or don't understand it. And it's not only one reason that companies fail. Typically, it's multiple reasons, but the top two have to do with marketing and finance. So we're going to focus on active examples of that. So what is active learning? Well, it's kind of a new term. There are actually three forms of learning that have been studied and talked about: passive, experiential, and active. And I'm going to tell you what they mean. In the passive learning, it's where students absorb information passively via lectures. In experiential learning, there's much more hands-on immersive experiences that occur as a part of learning, not just listening to a professor drone on. And in active learning, it encompasses a variety of very interactive techniques aimed at fostering participation and critical thinking in and out of the classroom. So what does this really mean? Let's say, for example, your goal was to be a race car driver. You wanted to be a famous race car driver. That's a good profession. So if you, so what you would do, you would enroll in a school. You're young, you're ready to go race car driving, and you should enroll a school. Good, there are a lot of them out there. If it were a passive form of learning about race car driving, the students would learn concepts such as history of race car driving, or technology of race cars, or how to repair them, or who are the famous race car drivers, and maybe what are the great tracks around the world. That's okay for some kinds of courses. If it were an experiential kind of a course, the students are introduced to and hear from successful race car drivers, and they might even spend some time in a race car simulator. That would be, and in fact, a lot of, I would say it's very common in courses, particularly entrepreneurship courses, to have experiential learning, invite famous entrepreneurs, who doesn't want to hear from Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates or somebody like that. However, if you were engaged in active learning, you would actually be driving a race car. You'd practice your driving. And at the end of the course, your final exam would be entering a race in which you can demonstrate your driving proficiency. Okay, so that's the real difference. And the active form of learning is something that's only come around in the last 10 or 15 years or so. So what does this have to do with the teaching of entrepreneurship? Well, I'm going to argue everything, and that's really what we're going to talk about. Passive, if you were taking a passive instructor who taught entrepreneurship passively, what would happen would be the teacher talks about concepts: opportunity, creativity, risk, failure, leadership, innovation, vision, goal setting. Students take quizzes and exams to verify they've understood the concept. And what that leads to is kind of stuff that's nice to know, might even get them stimulated, but does it really help somebody who wants to be an entrepreneur? I would argue not. If you were taking a course that was sort of experiential in entrepreneurship, the teacher adds some color to the concepts, maybe talks from successful entrepreneurs and do case studies, which is pretty cool. The students are hopefully engaged and stimulated by learning about real-world entrepreneurial experiences. And what that leads to is definitely more stimulating and informative. But what do case studies and talks from entrepreneurs really give the students in the way of useful tools, something useful, okay? Active in entrepreneurship is teacher trains the students in the use of actual tools. They have to go through the process of ideation. How do you think of a good idea? How do you understand the market and what the potential for that idea is in the market? That would include competition. You may have technical development. You've got to do financial projections. And what are the investors? You need money. You need to raise money. How do you do that? And how are you going to get the money back to them? And what they do is they form teams, they ideate, they quantitatively define their markets, they make believable financial projections, they write a business plan, and they actually give an investor pitch to real investors. And that's what my students do. And that's what I mean by active teaching. So what they are doing is they're driving the race car. Okay. Now, it's not real in the sense that they're actually forming a company, but I would say in the 18 years or so I've been teaching this, I probably have had 2,000 students, maybe hundreds of business plans. Probably about 10% of those actually turned into real businesses. And in fact, one was, but the group all became very wealthy. They were a group of students from the country of Peru in South America. Interesting story in and of its own right. So the main focus is on writing a business plan. And this is kind of a summary. You start with an executive summary and go through all these things and get a marketing and sales plan. Then you talk about the team and the financial plan. That's sort of the layout of a business plan. I'm going to pick two examples and explain to you what I mean by active learning versus passive learning. And the first is from the marketing and sales part of the plan, which is important. Let me ask you, if you have an answer to this, it would be great. Can you tell me the difference between advertising and promotion? Does anyone want to give a try at that? I don't know the background of the people here. If you're marketing people, you might have an answer, but anyone want to try that? Okay, well, we're going to find out. When you take a class in marketing, one of the important concepts they talk about is something called the customer purchase decision process. What goes through a customer or potential customer's mind? And this is the way it's taught. The customer says, oh, I need something, whatever I need. Maybe I need a new car. So I go out and I look for information about cars, and then I kind of look at alternatives and I probably drive a few of them. Then I make a decision, and then I decide whether or not I like it. Okay. And that's taught as one of the most important concepts in marketing is the customers go through this thing called a purchase decision process. Well, this is what the informed marketing person in industry would say. This is fine as a list of steps that a customer goes through. You could read them, understand them, and they make sense. I understand these steps and they make sense, but what do I do with this information as a person who wants to influence them? So what? Why should I care? And that's how a real marketing person in industry thinks about this. There's a more useful way to think about it. And I'm going to start with a quote. If you want to make a friend out of an enemy, ask him or her to do a favor for you. Okay. Now, I would ask you what that means to you, but it'll be obvious in a few minutes. If you take the customer purchase decision process and you get rid of purchase decision and make it influencing and change the word customer to consumer, now you have something very different, because customers and consumers are different terms in marketing. If you make, for example, a mass market, maybe you make toothpaste, that's your market. You don't sell that toothpaste to people individually. You sell it to Walmart or some big Carrefour or something. That's your customer. The consumer is the person who actually buys it at the store and uses it to brush their teeth, say. So how do you influence consumers? And you can't influence them unless they're aware. They have to be aware of who you are. If they're not aware of who you are, they're not going to give it a try. And here's an example. Here's a company, well known. Everyone knows who these folks are. And then it's more than just being aware of who they are. It's understanding what they do. Okay. And here's the mission at Jaguar. We create and build beautiful, fast cars. Okay. There's an example. Beautiful, certainly looks fast to me. Then beyond understanding, they need to be motivated. There needs to be some reason for them to try you. Okay. And that involves communicating, the benefits to the target audience. Maybe you really want a beautiful, fast car. That's one form of benefit. It's called a functional benefit. Maybe you want to be seen in a beautiful, fast car. And that's a different kind of benefit. It's called an emotional benefit. So, and I'm not covering all this today, but I'm just trying to take you through this process. Then if I'm motivated, I'm going to give it a try. And hopefully I'll come back and repeat. Okay. And so this is the way marketing people think about marketing. Okay. Clearly, if you're just aware and understand, maybe you're not so much involved with the product, but when you try it and repeat it, you're really involved. The first three things are called attitudes. In other words, how a customer thinks. They haven't done anything yet. The last two are behavior. That is how a customer acts. And here's the thing, and this is a very important psychological thing, is that your attitudes and behavior are linked very, very thoroughly in your mind. Okay. For example, it might be that you think killing somebody is wrong, and you've never killed anyone in your life. But lo and behold, you come along somebody who really bothers you or you really don't like, and you get into a big argument and you kill them. Now you've got a cognitive dissonance here. Your attitude it's wrong, but your behavior just, so you have to adjust your attitudes for the behavior. Very important marketing concept. Here's an example, a marketing, not a killing example. You know, every time I walk into the pharmacy and buy toothpaste every month, I buy Crest because 9 out of 10 dentists recommend it. It's great. But I walk into the pharmacy one time and there's Colgate there, but there's a sign 50% off, a discount. Oh, I buy the Colgate because I want a hot dog for dinner, and I can buy a hot dog with the difference. And so I walk out of the store. But I don't think Colgate is best. I think Crest is best. Next month, I come back in to buy I go to the Crest thing, and there's Colgate, 2 for 1. My goodness, another deal, another motivating deal. You walk out. If you do this enough, you will convince yourself that Colgate is better, and you'll stop doing Crest. Okay? So now, maybe you understand this quotation. If you want to make a friend out of an enemy, ask them to do a favor for you. If you have an enemy, obviously their attitude and behavior are opposed to you. If they do a favor for you, you have changed their behavior. They're doing a favor for you. If it's a big enough favor, it might be you'll change their attitude and they'll be your friend. Okay, so now. Again, we haven't gone through the whole course here, but you can see advertising and promotion are used for 2 different things. Advertising is the way to make a customer aware, make a potential customer, if it's good advertising, understand, and even eager or motivated. Promotion is to take them from that motivational point to a point where they actually try. Okay, so we've talked about this in the concept that this what I'm talking about, the consumer decision process. I'm talking about consumer influencing processes is a form of active teaching. Okay, now I want to turn to another example, and that's from a financial plan. Let me ask you this: are any of you business folks? Or where are you folks from? Are you professors or students or business people? Can you give me an idea?
Hey, we have one response
Anybody?
from Joe. He says he's an entrepreneur.
Good. Okay. So, well, good. I hope a successful one. So if you ask most people, including investors, what's the most important financial statement for a company? As you may know, there are 3 important statements. There's something called a profit and loss statement or a statement of operations. There's something called a cash flow, and there's something called a balance sheet. Well, if you ask Google AI, it says flat out income statement. Often the first place an investor or analyst will look is the income statement. Shows the performance of the business. Okay, that's cool. If you ask ChatGPT, it gives a little bit more nuanced answer. It says investors prioritize the income statement, but creditors and lenders usually focus on the cash flow statement. And of course, management need all 3. If you ask Microsoft Copilot, you really get closer to the answer. And it's also some nice comments. They say cash flow because without cash is king. It shows the actual liquidity. Profits are paper, and And if your cash flow is very strong and it's positive every period, that's what you really need to look at. When a lot of folks are taught about entrepreneurship, they are encouraged to do a P&L projection, a profit and loss projection. Okay. And this is kind of what it might look like. And I'm just giving this as an example for some period, let's say a year. Okay, so I've got a certain amount of revenues, I've got a certain amount of cost of goods, I've got overhead expenses and maybe some depreciation, which means you can depreciate assets. And it's important to know there are lots of other terms for these things, but the important thing you look at is what is your gross profit? In this case, I sold $100 worth of goods. It cost me $40 to make those goods. So my gross profit is $60. And I have some marketing and sales and other kinds of expenses. And I end up with an operating profit of $20 and a net profit of $16. And the reason I chose these numbers, these are pretty good numbers. 60% margins and 20% indirect margins are pretty good. That might be, and if you did this for each of the next 5 years in your projections, it would look pretty good. Here's the issue. This doesn't say anything about cash. Okay. In other words, for example, you might pay salaries for that $15, or you might have rent you've got to pay, but there's other things in the profit and loss statement like depreciation, which is not a cash. In other words, it's when you depreciate an item, the entrepreneur will know. Let's say you spend $50,000 for a piece of equipment and you depreciate that. In other words, you take out a certain amount each year and that goes as part of your expenses. It artificially inflates your operating profit. But you paid $50,000 for that. So in cash, it's entirely there. So the P&L is arguably not the best thing. The best, the way an active person would ask you to do this is you've got to prepare a cash flow. It shows a status at one point in the time. And there's one reason why an entrepreneur generates a cash flow pro forma, which means a projection, how much money you're going to need to reach profitability. And I'm going to give you an example here. Okay. Cash in can only come from three sources. You sell something, you derive some revenue. Maybe you get a loan, maybe your friends or your parents, or maybe the bank gives you a loan, or maybe you raise money by selling equity in the company, stock. So here's an example, a made-up example for some number of periods. It could be months, it could be quarters, it could be years. But in this case, I'm laying this out in Excel, and I know by period 5, let's say quarter 5, I'm going to have some sales. I'm starting to sell. Okay, that's cool. Now then, so that's cash coming in, okay, and my projection. And then you look at all the expenses you have for cash going out, okay. Direct labor means labor that's used to make the product. So you're not making anything in these first 2 periods, but maybe you're hiring some people and getting ready to make some things because you're going to have some sales here. Similarly, you don't buy any equipment to make your things, but here's your $50,000 right there. And you're obviously outfitting your manufacturing facility here, and there's other kinds of expenses. And so, but there's some things that you probably have some early on sales. You need to have an office, you need some legal help and accounting help, and maybe you have some rent, okay? So you have expenses. So in the cash flow, you just compare those. You say at the beginning of each period, what did I start out with? 0. In the case of the first period, I had 15.5, so I'm ending up negative 15.5. Okay. Well, you look at this, it's all red down the bottom. And the first thing, so you say to yourself, my goodness, I can't do this. I can't live in the red. So what am I going to do? Let's get a loan. Okay. Or let's sell some equity. So my brother and some of his friends want to buy some shares on my company. So I put 100,000 in for equity. Okay. I put that right in the spreadsheet. Then I have the calculation. Looks like I'm good for the first couple of quarters, but look at that third quarter. I'm hiring people to manufacture. I'm buying some equipment. My rent's gone up a bit because I have now a little manufacturing facility. Utilities are going up. I'm in the red. And the rule is you can't run in the red. So you say to yourself, okay, well, let me see if I can take a loan out. I need 45,000 from my family or maybe from a bank, and I'll put that in when I start to get some expenses. And I look at that and say, look at that. I've got plenty of cash. I'm a little bit short here. Maybe in period 4, maybe I should make this 50 or 55. But that's what an investor needs to see to believe in you, to believe that you're going to be cash flow positive, because that's the king. Okay. Now, I've taught this many years, this kind of looking at cash flow. And one time when I was teaching in Virginia, I had a student say, but Dr. Price, you forgot something. And it was a teaching moment for me, a teaching moment for here. There is something wrong in what I did. And what's wrong is that when you have a loan, you have to pay that loan back. So you probably have to have an expense item that refers to that payback. Here it is. So I'm going to pay back the loan. And I noticed it didn't really change anything down here. I'm still good to go. Okay. So the rule is it's not possible for any business to operate with a negative cash ending balance for any period. That's it. And of course, if you're talking to a potential investor, somebody's going to loan you some capital, or buy some shares in your company, or somebody's going to loan you some money, then you have to show them this, and you have to tell them what you're doing. What are the specific things? You're hiring these people, these 3 people to do manufacturing. You're buying this piece of equipment to help manufacture your product. You have to tell them, and obviously what your sales and marketing plans are and all of that. Okay. So we're actually moving along quite smartly. I'm probably speaking too fast. And here's where there's a difference between the cash flow and the balance sheet. And that is that, and the profit and loss statement. The cash shows up as 50,000 because I paid that money right then and there for that piece of equipment. In the P&L, that would show up as 5,000. Because I'm depreciating it over 10 periods. There's a lot of other expenses like that. So that's why the cash flow is really the king in terms of projecting out your needs and what you're going to need from your investors as you move forward. Okay. So let's go back to our race car. Who can make a really good race car driving teacher in an active mode? A race car driver. Why? Because he or she teaches driving tools, not driving concepts. Okay. So who can make a really good teacher of entrepreneurship? An experienced entrepreneur. Why? Because he or she teaches entrepreneurship tools, not entrepreneurship concepts. Okay. And when my students take the course, they actually, when we look at, they have to show me exactly what they're going to do to move the prospective customer or prospective consumer, to make them aware, to make them better than aware, to make them understand what my service or product is, and make them motivated. Good advertising can do all 3. Crappy advertising doesn't do much. And then how do I promote it? How do I get them to try? They have to show me specifically how that's done. And that's really important for entrepreneurs to understand. Okay. Now, there are parts of the business plan that are really important. I mean, anyone can describe a problem and solution. Anyone can talk about their company. Anyone can talk about mostly how they're going to develop their product. If it's a highly technical product, let's say, there might be some development, particularly in regulated areas like drugs or medical devices or something like that. But what I really need to understand, and where the tools part to active teaching comes in, is in the markets, how you define markets, and how you look at competition. Okay, because competition is not who you think it is. Competition is who your customers or prospects think it is. very important part. And my students here in Mexico are presenting their team marketing and sales plans next Thursday, a week from today. You describe your team, but and it's really important that the team has some experience. But what the investor looks at is the financial plan. What is your cash flow looking like, and what is your P&L looking like? Are you going to be making a lot of money to pay me back? How much money do you need based upon your cash flow analysis? What are you going to do with it? Okay, and what's the timing on all of that? And last but not least, what do I, as an investor, get back as a result of your success? Okay. And there's ways to think about all of these, which are, for example, in investor return, people say, well, if you give me $1,000, I'll get you back 10,000. Okay, well, that's a pretty good return. But does that 10,000 come back to me next year or in 100 years? Makes a big difference. So there are metrics that you have to learn to express to investors to get them excited. And there's within metrics, there's good performance and bad performance, and there's expectations. And those are things when you learn actively, you learn about, because that's what the investor is going to expect. Okay. So there are modern learning concepts like synchronous learning. I'm sure you've heard of this, or blended learning. How does this active learning fit into these concepts? Well, if you're thinking about synchronous, what is synchronous? It's teaching maybe in a classroom where you're with the people there. They're sitting there in the room and you're in the class. And you can do it by internet, by Zoom, or by some other, or TomTech or something like that. That's synchronous. Well, active learning can be done this way. Okay. And many of my courses are part Zoom and part in class. I prefer in class because you get to really interact better, but you can do it by Zoom. There's some new concept which all people are talking about called, this is just a summary. Active learning can be part of a synchronous learning environment. How about blended? Blended is where you have some live contact, some synchronicity, and then you have some asynchronous. In other words, you give them assignments, or they have to go off and read things and learn things to discuss among themselves. And it's sort of self-paced, right? You don't have to be in class or Zoom or live class at a certain point in time. That's blended learning. And active learning for entrepreneurship can be part of this as well. I teach it in all different ways. At the end of the day, it can't be completely asynchronous, obviously, because in the way when you teach entrepreneurship, the major part of the entire course is not for students to listen to the professor, even giving them tools, or read articles, or listen to some Bill Gates or somebody like. It's for them to form teams, come up with an idea, present as we move along and talk about marketing and sales or finance or operations, present their views of what they're going to do in their business plan, then ultimately assemble that. And last but not least, get in front of some real investors and do a pitch. Okay. Most of the class is students doing that work and presenting that work and getting ready for it, rather than me kind of blabbing at them like I'm blabbing to you guys right now. So does this work for race car driving? That is blended learning, asynchronous? I don't think so. Okay, so it's not for everyone, but you can do it with entrepreneurial thinking. Okay, so there's a take-home message, and I know I'm running way ahead of schedule, but I kind of talked too fast today. If you're in a race car, in a race, you're in the middle of a bunch of other race cars, or as we call them in marketing, competitors, okay? If you're kind of a business person, this is maybe what the race looks like, okay? You've got competitors, and they're well-dressed, they're smart, like you are. But if you win the race, it's because you've learned well. And if you're a happy entrepreneur, I think you're happy because you've been successful, you've learned actively. And in that leap of faith, maybe you'll be successful. I think you raise your chances quite a bit if you understand the tools, not the concepts, but understand how to use the tools of entrepreneurship. So I know I finished this really early, but I thank you for your attention. This is, by the way, I live in Mexico. I live south of the city of Guadalajara, which is about 7 million people. And this is a view from our back. We live south of the city on a big lake called Lake Chapala. It's about 80 kilometers by maybe 30 kilometers, and you can see there's mountains around it. And we're about 6,000 feet up. This is a picture one night so that's just my advertising for Mexico. Come to Mexico, travel, and spend money. So I thank you for all of your attention. Do you have some questions, some concerns, or does this make sense? I'd love to hear from you. And by the way, below is my email. If you ever have a question, just come to me with an email. I do respond.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Price. And thank you for your attention to the Tamkin community. Now we are opening for questions. If you've got any questions, you can raise your hands. If so, you can write them in the comment section. Else, you can read, for those that are following on our platform, you can write them in the comment section. Now read it out to Dr. Price so he can answer.
Sure.
Okay. So, Dr. Price, we do have one question coming from Nshima, and he says, for someone who would like to start a startup, is there a method I can use to determine when to get a loan and when not? Can you address that question?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, obviously, if your uncle is Bill Gates or Carlos Slim here in Mexico, or maybe I don't know who would be the equivalent person in Morocco, you probably don't need a loan. You probably got plenty of money to work with. However, if you do think you need to look at your cash flow and you need to let that document give you an idea of how much and when, okay? And it's the same whether it's a loan or whether you're selling stock. A loan is you got to pay it back, right? Selling equity is when the person invests and they take a share of your company. And there's all kinds of rules and advice for how long that takes, and depending upon your stage of development. There's something called technology readiness levels if it's a technology company, and there's 9 of them. It depends on where you are that you're more attractive to potential investors, either for a loan or for a equity investment. And yes, there are ways to plan for that. One sort of general rule is that, and there's all kinds. Let me add further. There's all kinds of vehicles for this, right? If I sell you shares in my company, okay, let's say you give me. I'm just starting. I'm a new entrepreneur. I need $10,000, and I'm going to sell you a part of my company. There are different ways of making that sale, and for me to get the money without committing to how much of the company I have to give you. You may say to me as an investor, I want 10% of your company for $10,000. That means they're valuing your company at about $90,000. You may think it's worth more. So there's something which we talk about in the class called convertible notes. In other words, it's a loan, and you pay interest on the loan, but you don't pay it back until later on when you raise a lot of money, say to launch into the market, and you give the person, and you don't know the valuation of the company. You're not arguing about whether the company's worth 90,000 or 100,000. You wait until you get to a certain point. You're maybe going to launch your product, and then the next set of investors comes and maybe gives you a much better price because they're buying stock, and you'll get a much higher valuation because you're further along. So there's all kinds of detailed ways to strike things into your favor as you're raising money. But as to when you need to get it, which is I think your question, need a really good cash flow analysis to and a believable one to attend to that timing. Did that answer the question?
I do not know. We'll wait for his response. But while waiting,
Sure.
there's another question that says, thank you for he says, thank you very much, Dr. Price, for teaching us about the practicality of entrepreneurship and how we can apply it by active learning. But either way, are there any books that you would recommend that would help one that is trying to learn without actually engaging in or putting their money inside the system?
Well, there are a lot of really good books out there, and there are a lot of tools books. I don't have a name or a book. What I can do, I can provide you with some names later on. But what is confusing, when I first started thinking about the course, I started teaching this course in 2007. And I was teaching at a university in Texas at the time. And at that time, I went out and looked for textbooks. I looked for all kinds of books. And they're really interesting books, good books. And I can give a list. There's one author who's really good. I can't remember her name right off, but I'll send it to you and you can send it on to the individual. But her books were like tools. They were like, say, well, this is how you do this. This is how you do that. This is why this is important. And she's written about 8 or 10 books for entrepreneurs. The issue with those, you got to figure out yourself what's important and what's not important. Okay. But they're very useful in terms of how-to books. You want to calculate your return on investment, ROI, this is how you do it. Boom. And there's an author, a lady whose name I cannot remember at the moment. But if you hold on about 10 seconds, I can give it. Hold on. Okay, here's my best recommendation. The lady who's written a series of books, her name is Rhonda, Rhonda. Her last name is Abrams, Abrams. She's probably written, and the book that I've used is called Entrepreneurship, a Real World Approach. And it's listed as a hands-on guide for today's entrepreneur. It's a paperback. It's 500 pages, but it really covers a lot of interesting topics. And it also has worksheets in it. So in other words, it's got if you're looking at ideas, it's got your bright idea worksheet. How do you formulate a basic business concept worksheet? Now, she has written probably 5 or 6 books, different books, and this may not be her latest one, but it's very helpful, very informative. For me, it's a problem because if I were to teach her entire book, it would take me 6 years to go through it because it's just a lot of information and material. But it's full of worksheets, so you can fill them out and say, from every aspect of a business, not just the idea, but how you're going to distribute, how you're going to do your financial calculations. It's all worksheets. It's really cool. So that would be my first recommendation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Price. There's another question, one which is more interesting. It says, why do some entrepreneurs say they learn better from failure than from success? And would you concur?
Oh, my goodness. I have a whole lecture on that. Maybe we should do that sometime. No. Failure is probably the most important feature of success for entrepreneurs. And in that part of one of my lectures, and it's funny because I start off by asking the students, is it okay to fail? And depending upon when you ask the question and where you ask the question, you get different answers. I'm going to presume that in Morocco it would be okay to fail. Okay, it's not so in other countries, right? But and then I give examples, and I'll give you a couple of examples. Does anyone know who, but I need, does anyone know who Colonel Sanders is? Do you have Kentucky Fried Chicken in Morocco?
Yeah, we do. We do.
Okay. Well, you know, he's very successful. He's gone now, but when he first started his company, he had a recipe for selling chicken. Not for selling, for making really good chicken. It was his grandmother's recipe, and he didn't want to sell it. He wanted to sell the recipe to a chicken place, and there are many chicken places, as you know. And he tried 1,500 times. 50 tried to interest companies. Here in Mexico, we've got companies like that. They're called Pollo Pepe, which is Pepe the chicken, you know. And he tried to interest companies in that in his grandmother's recipe. Nobody was interested. And so he said, okay, well, I'm going to start a store and do it myself. But anyone know who Sylvester Stallone is?
I think everyone knows who Sylvester Stallone is.
Yeah, of course, Rocky. He's famous for Rocky. Well, that he wrote Rocky. He wrote the screenplay. He was going to make a movie and star in it. And he had more than 900 meetings with, and failed 900 times with investors, movie houses, and movie investment places, and all. And they all said he was full of crap. He failed over 900 times, and he decided to go out and do it himself. And he did. He learned from that, and it's kind of a sad story because he sold everything to produce that movie, including his dog, which he loved. So yes, the answer is failure is a very strong teacher. Okay, because and it's not something you run from. It's something you learn from, right? And so, all the list of companies that I gave you when I introduced myself, most of them failed. You know, when an investor looks at their investment portfolio, and I'm part of investment teams, right? The way they look at it is let's say you're with a venture capital firm, you'll make 10 investments, let's say, in the course of a year. 7 of those will fail. 2 of them will do okay. Maybe you'll make most of your money back, but 1 of them will get you back at 10 to 1 or 15 to 1 return. And overall, of those 10 investments, if you add everything up, you're going to make a nice, healthy 30 or 40% a year on those investments. And so failure is an option. Don't be afraid to fail. You'll learn from it, and you'll be better for it.
And I think our final question says, in what ways does digital or online learning support entrepreneurs today?
Well, many ways. Okay. First of all, when you say online learning, I'm presuming the questioner is talking about learning about concepts or tools or things like that. I mean, related to entrepreneurship. But online offers so many other ways to get information, right? If I want to know, if I'm starting a new, I'll use the example of the folks in Peru. They had idea to feed waste to plants at a very economic way. So they could go online and look to see in Peru, their home country, how the big plants got their waste. You know, like cardboard or plastic or glass. And it turned out they got it all from they had no collection facilities in Peru. They imported it all from Argentina and other places at $100 a ton. They knew they could collect it and sell it for $40 a ton to these companies. That was their idea. But they had to go on the internet and find out all this information, which was available to them. And certainly AI is going to play a role in making that more easily available. If you analyze international markets, you can do that through AI. So information is there. It's a question, and you can get it much faster and I think much more convincingly complete than you could even 10 years ago. So that's one answer to that question, information. The other answer is, could you, I don't think you could passively read things on the internet and learn how to be an entrepreneur. You need to do something. You need to be active about it. You need to be have a person or people who are going to counsel you through ideation and how you plan, how you actually look at a market, and how you define it. Because when you go, most entrepreneurs need to raise money, like Colonel Sanders and like Sylvester Stallone, and I give other examples. They have to convince somebody that their idea is a good idea, and they have a better product than is out there, and they have a receptive market, and you need to go through that. You need to go through that. It's a tough process, and you need help along that way, and that's best done in probably a classroom format where you're actually having to do it, not hearing about it. I hope that answers the question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think, thank you very much, Dr. Price. I don't know if I am allowed to, let me ask. I know I'm the moderator, but
Sure.
I'll also ask
Go
my
for
own
it.
question. So my question
Go
goes as
for it.
follows. Looking at what we've learned and what we've learned so far on how to apply entrepreneurship, I've come to experience that sometimes ideas work in one environment and do not work in others. Like the same idea, same way of bringing it out, and it works in one environment. So I was thinking, do culture differences really affect the way entrepreneurs develop or excel? Are some ideas accepted in one place, rejected in another place, or is it all about messaging?
No, it's not about, well, messaging is important, right? But no, that's a topic of study, a field of study, and it's not just for entrepreneurs. It is for big companies too. If say you started your business in Morocco, and I once started a business in Morocco. It was actually a Russian invention, right? And it was a drug, okay, but but Morocco's a nice market and all, but most people who start in Morocco or start in Mexico or start in other countries, so smaller countries, let's say, realize that they must go to bigger markets, maybe Europe, maybe the United States, maybe China. I don't know. And for them to be able to do that, they need data. They need culture. There's a guy named Dr. Van Wood. He's kind of the world expert, and he lectured to my students just last Thursday, and he talked about how companies use analytics to ascertain which market you should go to. If you're a Ford Motor Company and you've been selling cars in the United States for 100 years, which they were, where do I go next? Do I go to China? Do I go to Japan or to Europe? Which country is better? And there's all kinds of cultural and other reasons. And there's actually 6 different dimensions of reasons, one of which is cultural. So you gotta, if you're starting in Morocco, let's say, with your entrepreneurial venture, you're probably going to have a pretty good idea of whether your culture is going to be accepting of your idea, right? And you have to understand that, right? And it involves more than just cultural feelings. It involves competitors and who else is out there, right? And if you have a good message and you have a product with superior capabilities or cheaper price or whatever, you'll probably do well. But if you take that same product, you may take it to another India, say, for example, which is a nice big market, and it fails culturally. And there's ways to figure that out. And involving AI, you can probably do it in less than 2 days now with Van Wood's algorithms and things like that. So I know I've kind of broadly expanded the question you had, but all of these things, data are available. There are great databases, and they're even available for your own country. If you're thinking of something in Morocco, you can get this information about the culture. But culture is only one of about 6 or 8 different dimensions that are employed. Okay. In determining whether or not you'll have product success or not.
All right, that is the last of our questions. Thank you very much, Dr. Price, for such a wonderful lecture. And There is a call in the comment section on the other platform. They're saying if we could have a lecture on failure, that would be nice. So I'll see how many people want to attend, and then I think we can get
A
that one
lecture
done
on what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. A lecture what?
on failure, entrepreneurship and failure.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Yeah, actually, I do. That's a good idea. Yeah, I could certainly create that because there's so many great examples, right? And let me leave you with a quote. I like quotes. Thomas Edison is probably the biggest example of failure, right? Now, he invented the light bulb. Great. And he is very famous for inventing the light bulb. But does anyone know how many different elements he tried before he found that tungsten was the right element for his light bulb? Anyone know that story? Well, it's more than 10,000. Took him years and years and years. And he said something, and a very important quote. He said, inspiration is, success is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. That is working hard. Part of that's failing, right? And if he were around today and sitting in amongst this group, I think he would agree with the statement that innovation is the same. Bringing a product successfully to market is 1% the idea, the product, 99% making it work, which involves obviously technical things and marketing things and all that. And that's really what the course is about. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that sometime with those other examples. So, yeah, thank you.